Thank you all so much for coming to my talk. Technological unemployment fears have existed for over 100 years. The rise of recorded sound and its visible impact on musicians was widely reported. The copy machine was blamed for extinction of writers since they wouldn't get royalties on book sales. Fears of robots and how they'll take over many jobs surfaced, and the invention of the internet also led to job loss worries. So these fears have now resurfaced during my life with the advent of AI. AI is now as good or better than radiologists, and there are questions about whether LLMs like ChatGPT may make lawyers obsolete. These fears have been amplified by prominent voices in the AI community. Elon Musk has said that there'll come a point when no job is needed, and Hinton has advised people to go get a job in plumbing. This talk is not about the job loss narrative. Those narratives are often sold by experts and executives, but they are too simplistic. They do not reflect how AI actually shows up in people's working lives. The real-world impacts of AI on work are messier. They are more nuanced and more diverse than a single story about jobs disappearing. So instead of asking only whether AI will eliminate jobs, I ask how AI systems present themselves inside workers' everyday experiences. This leads to the core thesis of my dissertation. AI's impact on work becomes visible, measurable, and actionable for policy when we examine how workers experience and contest deployed AI systems in real-world settings. The first question that I ask is, how do AI and algorithmic systems actually shape workers' experiences, opportunities, pay, and ability to contest decisions? My second question asks, how can worker-centered evidence about those impacts be collected, generated, and interpreted to support policy and worker action? Together, these questions move the talk from abstract claims about AI and work to evidence which is grounded in workers' experiences. This is the structure of my talk. I organize the work around three ways of producing worker-centered evidence. First, I measure. I use AI audits to study how social media platforms can shape labor market opportunity. Second, I surface. I use mixed methods. Mixed methods here means qualitative and quantitative methods across online forums and rideshare platforms to identify worker concerns and translate them into transparency demands. And third, I equip. I build systems with labor organizations so that evidence can support wage fairness and lost wage claims. So together, these projects move from measuring harms to surfacing worker experience to equipping workers and organizers to act on that evidence. Now, let me move on to the first part of my talk, measure. Here I conduct an AI audit to study labor market opportunity on social media platforms using Facebook as an example. The policy question here is whether platforms can contribute to discrimination based on who gets access to job opportunities. I want to begin with a motivating example. In 2022, a women truckers group filed a complaint alleging that Facebook was steering lucrative truck driving jobs away from women and older workers. That raised a concrete question. What kind of evidence would actually help show whether this was happening? To answer that, I first need to give some context about targeted advertising, so how advertisers create ads, and how platforms decide who actually sees them. There are two phases in targeted advertising, targeting and delivery. During targeting, an advertiser chooses a budget, creates an ad by selecting images, text, and destination page links. Then a target audience is chosen by specifying a combination of one or more of their demographic characteristics, location, and interests. The ad is then run through the delivery process where Facebook algorithmically decides which ads to show to which users according to the total ad value equation. These algorithms leverage machine learning, are opaque, and may be biased. Finally, the ads are delivered to only a subset of the target audience that the platform thinks are relevant. Both targeting and delivery phases can result in discrimination. In the case of targeting, prior work has found that advertisers could misuse the targeting tools, including algorithmic audience creation mechanisms, to exclude people based on gender, race, age, and location from seeing job and housing ads. In response to lawsuits and Facebook's own commissioned civil rights audit, Facebook in 2019 disabled access to targeting tools based on the attributes for job ads. But researchers found that discrimination could still occur due to the ad delivery algorithm. So for example, prior work by Ali et al. Showed that ads can be skewed by gender solely due to the ad content, such as text and images. As we can see, an ad recruiting a preschool teacher delivered to a 95% female audience, whereas an ad recruiting for the lumber industry delivered to only an 8% female audience, even though the advertiser targeted a gender-balanced audience and ran the ad simultaneously. Prior work by Kaplan et al. Has shown that Facebook amplifies the skew in ad delivery due to the implied demographic identity of people in the images. So consider an advertiser running a pair of ads simultaneously, recruiting for the lumber industry, one containing an image of a white man and the other containing an image of a black man. Ads with black people are delivered more to black users compared to ads showing white people. This leads to a hypothesis that an advertiser's selective use of people in job ad images, combined with the bias of the ad delivery algorithm, can circumvent current non-discrimination protections of the platform. To test this hypothesis, we use the ad library and search for evidence of stereotypical image use. Additionally, we use recent data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to establish the demographics of the US labor force. This methodology of comparing representation with BLS is consistent with prior research by Metaxa et al. In 2021. I want to now provide some highlights of our findings. So in occupations with a de facto gender skew in the real world, like nurses and truck drivers, we found many examples of only stereotypical image use. So here are some examples. If you look at the first row here, Total Nurses Network, it depicts women in all 10 of their images. And Hire Master on the bottom depicts men in all 7 of their images. So to highlight our overall results, we find that among the advertisers who use people in their images, 57% of truck driver advertisers and 42% of nurse advertisers use people of only stereotypical gender. But when we analyze the advertiser behavior across diverse occupations, the overall results highlight a different message. We find that the majority of advertisers actually overrepresent women and black people. These are depicted above the 45-degree reference line in the plot, and a majority of advertisers also underrepresent white people, and they're depicted below the 45-degree reference line in the plot. So broadly, advertisers may be attempting to diversify their existing workforce across a diverse set of occupations. Ultimately, what we saw was that having any image on the job ad can have impacts on the user experience and ad delivery. So what can be done here? Should we just go back to job portals and bulletin boards? An advantage of that approach is that users can then have agency to seek out the job that they want. So in our work, we actually take the view and call for disabling ad delivery optimization for job ads entirely. Obviously, there's a societal cost involved here to ensuring fairness. It may become harder for some folks to find relevant jobs, but we think that such cost can actually be managed. There is a lot of value in targeted ads for other areas, like products, but we think in the case of jobs, everyone should have equal access. Ultimately, it's left to the user if they actually want to apply to the job, but Facebook should not have a role in determining who gets access to it. So to conclude, this was an example of generating evidence of potential discrimination as a result of advertiser image selection on Facebook, which impacts job seekers. Now I want to move on to the second part of my dissertation, which is surface. AI's impact on workers is actually messier than simply being replaced and broader than a single discrimination outcome. To surface these messy impacts, I develop a method using LLMs to make sense of how workers themselves talk about AI. So our main research question here is, what are the economic impacts of AI from a worker's perspective? We came up with a novel method called QAM, which enables thematic analysis of text data. So given unstructured text, you can think of discussions on Facebook or Reddit and other social media, we converted to a prevalence quantified hierarchical list of themes to something like what you would get after a survey. As you can see in the right half of this figure, as a top level theme, and a bunch of sub-themes. Each of these sub-themes are associated with a quote, and there's also a prevalence percentage. We also built a system prototype so that users can interact with this. We then used two sources of data to analyze how workers themselves talk about the impacts of AI. We weren't actually prescriptive here about what type of AI, but left it broadly construed. First, we turned to online forums. So Reddit was one such forum with candid discussions of workers. We collected over 5.5 million posts and comments from relevant subreddits. We had an entire methodology for automatically identifying and filtering subreddits. Second, we conducted chatbot-led interviews. So each interview lasted 30 to 45 minutes. We transcribed the interviews, resulting in just over 1,000 transcripts, and these workers were recruited on Prolific and are based in the US. This work was done in partnership with the Nuremberg Institute for Market Decisions in Germany. And the goal was to understand what concerns emerged from these sources. We applied the core methodology across these two data sources. We focused on the topic of economic impacts of AI on workers. I want to now highlight briefly the themes that emerged from this analysis. We obtained a list of 35 top-level themes about the economic impacts of AI on workers. Our themes are hierarchical, and so what I've displayed here is just the top-level themes, and we can get deeper on any specific theme. We also have access to the quotes from people during their interviews or comments on Reddit, which are associated with that theme. Let me now highlight some of them. And there's a spectrum of sentiments about AI, positive, negative, or neutral. And so workers said that they value psychological well-being at work. They found that AI adoption may actually lead to higher productivity. They had concerns about job obsolescence. AI was actually viewed as potentially reducing bias in hiring compared to humans. They had salary and compensation issues, the support for labor rights, and they had concerns and questions about how to cope with uncertainty. And so overall, as you can see here, the key takeaway that I want you to have is that the impacts here are so much broader than just job loss or discrimination, which is the typical narrative that dominates popular media. It's not just the binary automate or augment, whatever that means, right? We've also applied the core methodology to a number of different settings. One such setting is to submit responses to government requests for comments and consultations. So here's an example of a response to an EU AI Act consultation. We've also used it in our own research. So for example, it formed a part of the methodology for this paper, which I'll talk about later in the talk, and it also helped inform a policy memo. To summarize the key takeaways so far, first, as we saw in the example of Facebook, deployed AI and algorithmic systems are often opaque, and their decisions can meaningfully impact workers, shaping access to pay and control at work. Second, worker-centered perspectives can, and they should inform policy, because workers often see how these systems actually operate in practice. Motivated by this, I now move into one specific domain of work, which is gig work. So gig workers earn income through temporary or on-demand jobs rather than traditional long-term employment. Rideshare workers, you can think of them as Uber or Lyft drivers, are one of the largest groups of gig workers in the US, and rideshare platforms are going to be the focus of the rest of my talk. I'll begin with a study of the transparency-related concerns rideshare workers have about AI and algorithmic decisions. So we're still in part 2, but focusing on surfacing concerns from rideshare platforms. Drivers' lack of autonomy and agency in the rideshare industry and associated financial, physical, and emotional harms have been well documented by researchers of the gig economy. Recently, there's also been a lot of media attention about what drives this lack of agency. So here are a few stories concerning AI and algorithmically determined wages and their impact on workers. So here's a story from the markup which says that a secretive algorithm will now determine Uber driver pay in many different cities. Here's another article about who's really at the wheel for Uber and Lyft. In many ways, it's AI. And then there's another article about how drivers are rising up against Uber's opaque pay system because it makes it impossible to understand the algorithms that actually decide how much they get paid. So this unequal access to information creates what scholars like Rosenblatt and Stark call an information asymmetry. So the situation where rideshare platforms like Uber or Lyft has more or better information than marketplace conditions than individual drivers do. The researchers have proposed interventions to mitigate information asymmetries in the gig economy, such as facilitating peer-to-peer information sharing and enabling workers to engage in surveillance. Companies like Mistro and GigU have also started to address information asymmetries in the gig economy by providing tools that help workers quickly synthesize offer information. Despite all this research, the problem still remains. Gig worker platform interfaces themselves have remained largely unchanged in terms of the quality and amount of information that is shown to workers. And moreover, how these non-transparent AI and algorithmic decisions which shape drivers' working conditions and coping strategies are underexplored. And so in this work, we are interested in two specific outcomes. So one is we explore policy, explore how policy can be used as a lever to incentivize platforms to implement more transparent design interfaces. And we ground our recommendations to policymakers in concrete changes to the design interface that promote transparency. Okay, so in this work, we asked two specific research questions. First, what are the transparency-related harms, mitigation strategies, and needs of rideshare workers? And two, what policy solutions may mitigate worker harms and address worker needs? When we talk about transparency in this work, we refer to the interpretability and accessibility of information that is presented to workers on the app interface. I want to provide a little context about our understanding of how rideshare platforms actually operate. So this figure depicts the various stakeholders in the rideshare ecosystem, the platform, the driver, and the rider. Through AI-driven algorithms, the rideshare platform matches drivers and riders and determines driver wages, rider prices, routes, and promotions. We used a mixed methods approach to answer our research questions. So first, we browsed Reddit for a broad understanding of discussions of rideshare workers relevant to the platform's non-transparent AI and algorithmic decisions. We then developed an interview protocol and conducted interviews to surface drivers' concerns, mitigation strategies, and needs relevant to transparency. So I recruited drivers in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. I brought them to the lab. Some of them came here to this very room. We printed out screenshots of different algorithmic decisions that the platforms make and asked drivers to reflect on them. So specifically, during 90 minutes one-on-one interviews, I asked drivers to annotate screenshots of rideshare platforms to identify missing, confusing, or misleading information across all the three different phases of a ride. So at or before pickup, during the ride, and at or after drop-off. In parallel, to complement the depth of interviews with the breadth of other drivers' concerns across a much larger population, we used an LLM to analyze all of the r/Uber drivers and r/Lyft drivers posts and comments from 2019 to 2022 on Reddit, leveraging initial broad themes that we obtained from our interviews and some themes that we got from prior work. So combining the analysis from interviews and LLMs, here's what we found. So we found that there's a lack of transparency in rideshare operations across four main features: promotions, fares, routes, and task allocations. I want to now highlight some of our findings across two of these categories. So I spent most of the time on promotions and then one highlight from task allocations. So what exactly are promotions? Promotions are gamified incentives which are often personalized that allow drivers to increase their earnings if they meet some eligibility criteria. One such promotion is called surge pricing, which many of you may have heard of when you take a cab. So drivers get money if they pick up from specific locations at specific times of the day. So here's an example of the driver view of what the surge pricing map looks like. Uber's documentation says that surge pricing acts as a relief valve that leverages AI for current and forecasted demand conditions to dynamically balance demand and supply. But what do drivers think about this? So they called out misleading design patterns in the surge maps. So for example, P1 annotated the go button at the bottom of the screen, saying the surge disappears because the surge is dynamic, and by the time they actually reach the surge region, the surge value may have completely changed or disappeared altogether. P1 also annotated the boundary between neighboring surge regions, as this is a lie. So let's see why they actually annotated that way. So if we zoom in here, you can see that the $19 region and the $7.75 region are next to each other, but drivers don't actually know where one boundary ends and the other begins. So this really frustrates drivers and causes drivers like P8, a participant that we number, so P8. So the whole surge map is just terrible because you don't know where you need to be on the map to actually get the money. Rideshare drivers on Reddit help us understand additional ways that transparency harms related to promotions manifest in the user interface. So for example, one Redditor says that they can't understand how to qualify for these promotions because platforms provide maps with little to no details. So here's a quote saying, are they really expecting a thumbnail of a map with zero details where I need to be to have a ride qualify for the quest to be useful? You can also see that we have a count column on the right, and so that gives you a prevalence estimate. So how frequently occurring was a specific theme in our data set. When drivers encounter transparency harms, they develop inventive mitigation strategies and propose potential solutions to redesign the flow of information. So for example, when P9 encounters what they believe to be a misleading information about surges, they just choose not to act on that information, saying, I don't chase the surge because I know it changes with supply and demand. P7 suggests a design solution here to make promotions more predictable, saying that before the surge, they can actually send an SMS to drivers, saying this is what potentially you can make. Okay, so now I want to highlight just one more finding concerning a different aspect, which is task allocations. So what kind of rides or pay do drivers actually get? I'm going to play a short audio clip, which was recorded from one of our interview participants. And the participant actually came down here to this very room, actually. And so I'll play the audio clip now. Never mind, I will read it out. So this participant, P3, says, if you had two different phones and you got two different drivers, not everybody was getting paid the same. So one person was getting one thing and someone else was getting another. And I was like, that can't be right. Same distance, just different people for airport rides and even the scheduled rides. Why is one person offered a higher rate and why is another person offered a lower rate? So legal scholar Veena Dubal calls this algorithmic wage discrimination. And so without insight into how task allocation works, drivers worry about potential discrimination and unfairness. Okay, so those are a few highlights of our findings. And in short, we found that drivers need transparency into several aspects of the platform's decisions. So what can be done? We turn to policy solutions here because typical design recommendations from researchers fall short of implementation and impact, and there's no real incentives for platform data disclosure. It doesn't enhance their revenue, so it just isn't really helpful for the platform to invest in that. So we are inspired, though, by successful precedents in social media and AI models and existing data disclosures on rideshare in Chicago and New York City, which happened only due to legal mandates. So specifically, we call on rideshare platforms to publish periodic and public transparency reports by translating our empirical research into what we call indicators, or key pieces of information that workers need. So we defined 51 indicators that characterize transparency in rideshare platform, which is inspired by analysis of Reddit and the interview data. We divide the indicators into 4 broad categories. So first, indicators about ride statistics. Second, indicators about driver statistics. Third, about platform policies. And fourth, about algorithmic management. So although we published an academic paper and it was well received in the academic community, more importantly for us and the workers and organizers that we partner with, we also engaged in policy translation based on our research. So one such way was we translated our academic paper to a policy memo with our community partners and the CITP Tech Policy Clinic that Mihir over here runs. This memo calls for mandatory public data disclosures through rideshare transparency reports. This was very well received by our partners and widely shared through their networks. In March 2026, Uber, through its global head of AI and fairness policy, Sean Perryman, actually published its first transparency report describing many of the features that we called for in our paper and memo. And so this shows that collective and sustained research from academia can make tech companies more accountable. So to conclude, this research was an example of a study of gig workers to generate evidence on the impact of the platform's AI decisions on workers. Okay, so this concludes part 2. And so at this point, we've seen how researchers can actually provide evidence based on worker experiences to policymakers and to influence tech policy. Let's move on to the third part now. So this is the last part of my talk, which focuses on building worker-facing systems in the rideshare context that is guided by the question how we can give workers the tools to actually do something similar to what researchers were doing. So I'll first begin with a tool that we built called Fare. Okay, so through our earlier rideshare transparency study, we found that drivers need transparency into many aspects of platform decisions, such as promotions, fares, routes, and task allocations. So one of the main concerns that drivers had was around wages. Ultimately, that's what drivers care about the most. So I want to now focus on that. One question that drivers were interested to know is what percentage of the rider's price does a driver actually get paid? This was a concern which was reflected across many of our interviews and Reddit discussion. So for example, P7 here says, you're supposed to take 10%, but because of all additional fees, they take more than 30%, which is a problem for a lot of drivers. Another Reddit user says, guy told me they should charge him $125, but I only got $54, and $12 of that was the passenger tips. Another Reddit user refers to Lyft as grift, which is a slang for a dishonest scheme, and says you charge the passenger $24 to go 1.5 miles and want to pay me only $4? Okay, so you may also have wondered when you take an Uber or Lyft ride, how much the driver gets paid. So the rider price, or how much you're actually charged as the customer, is split between the driver wage and the platform take. But how this rider price is split, that is these percentages that you see in the figure, are unknown. This data is not just an individual need, it's also a collective need. So in reality, even if individual drivers knew what this take rate is, organizers of driver collectives still wanted to understand the patterns across all rides and drivers. So how do we do this collective data aggregation at scale and in a safe way? Anecdotal evidence on driver forums and our own experience speaking with drivers show that the platform take rate is highly unpredictable, ranging from 10% all the way to the high 90s. So on average, across all rides of a driver, Uber and Lyft claim that the rates are about 30%. So to give you a concrete example, say the customer pays $100, Uber takes $35, and the driver gets $65, then the take rate here would be 35%. This variability and unpredictability is to be expected because Uber says that their pricing technology leverages AI and their algorithms are dynamic. So there is some stochasticity in the process. It would have been a lot easier to get this wage information if people were hanging out together like a white-collar job, but that's not the case with Uber or Lyft, where the boss is the platform and the workers are supposed to be independent contractors. To fight for better conditions in traditional firms, unions emerged. But in an algorithmic market, unions also struggle because information is very disorganized. So we need tools for labor organizers to help with data aggregation. Our approach to address this problem is through a tool called Fare. We built Fare in collaboration with our partner, a labor organization, Colorado Independent Drivers United, who wanted independent data on platform take rate to support passing a bill at that time, the Senate Bill 2475. It's one of the first state-level AI transparency bills for algorithmically mediated work. Fairfare is a web app. So drivers sign up on the app, they link their Uber or Lyft accounts and complete a survey. Once data syncs from their account, they get a text message with the take rate. So far, we've collected over 6 million rides across all the 50 states in the US. I want to highlight our key quantitative findings here. So first, we saw that the take rate peaks around 2021 to 2022 and declines steadily through early 2024 before rising again. Next, we find that participating drivers actually overestimate the actual take rate and perceive lower fare rates. And so in this figure, we have take rates from the Colorado drivers and non-Colorado drivers from across the population. And so the estimated rate, what drivers estimated to be, is close to 50%. But what they think is fair is between 20 to 27%, but the actual rate ends up being about 30%. So another finding that we have is airport rides, which are generally preferred by drivers and a common ride type, has a statistically significantly higher take rate. Take rates are also higher during surge periods, resulting in a statistically significant difference compared to non-surge periods. And so the increased customer price, the benefit of that is not completely passed on to the workers. Okay, I want to highlight some key qualitative findings here. So first, the reports that we generated using Fairfare data helped organizers achieve their legislative goals in two ways. So one, it helped informed draft legislation. And so an organizer here said, it gave us a clearer picture of what to debate as far as the language in the bill. It also helped create a national narrative where organizers told us that they had heard our name in different circles just randomly because this research is going in many different people's hands. Data collected using Fairfare also helped broader organizer efforts in two ways again. So one, it helped challenge platform narratives. And second, and this is an important point here, that it achieves safe data donation. And so organizers told us that this was a pathway to getting that information without the driver being at risk of the platform saying he harassed the passenger. And this is a big concern. Drivers are always afraid to have these conversations with passengers out of fear of being deactivated. Okay, I want to dive a little deeper on the legislation itself and its provisions that our data helped inform. So in June 2025, Senate Bill 2475 was passed in Colorado. Among other provisions, it guaranteed greater transparency in pay for both drivers and riders. So specifically, for both drivers and consumers, they can now view on a single app screen, after the consumer has been dropped off, the consumer pay, excluding tips, and the driver pay, excluding tips, any other pass-throughs like tolls. And this is in Colorado State. So I want to be a little precise here on what we actually mean by health policy. We don't want to overstate or inflate our claims. And so first, the data that we collected helped inform bill drafting. What this means is it gave organizers a clearer sense of what to debate and why transparency belonged in the bill. It provided independent evidence by replacing scattered screenshots with aggregate data that organizers could use to challenge platform narratives. It supported broader organizing efforts by making data donation safer and easier. It also informed expert testimony. So Samantha Dalal, who's in the room here, served as an expert witness in Colorado's defense of its rideshare transparency law, Senate Bill 2475, against Uber, where Uber raised a First Amendment challenge. The First Amendment in the US guarantees right to free speech, and Uber's claim here was that this was compelled speech, which was portraying them in bad light. So ultimately, Uber chose to settle before the trial. So in particular, we were not able to achieve take rate caps. There was no minimum wages that were set using our data. There's also no citation in the bill referencing Fairfare. But nevertheless, we played an important role in impacting the policymaking process. Our work received wide media attention. So our research was featured by More Perfect Union. Here's a QR code that you can scan if you want to see the video. We also got a press release from Princeton Engineering, and we were featured on the Princeton homepage. So Uber and Lyft, actually in the time that we've done this research, and we've done this for about 3 years now, but in the past 6 to 12 months, have begun to provide free breakdowns to some drivers in some regions other than Colorado. So you can see Uber's earning breakdown here. There's different parts. You can see the driver's own earnings, there are government taxes, there's estimated commercial auto insurance, customer promotions, and then Uber's actual service fee. And on the figure on the right, which may not be very clearly visible, you can see sometimes the platform might even lose money. So Uber here is minus 11%. Lyft has an earning commitment, which has come up recently. So the total Lyft fee will actually never exceed 30% of what passengers pay in a given month. This began in April 2026, and they even top up money if that isn't the case. Obviously, this isn't only because of our work, but certainly because of sustained academic research and calls for accountability from organizers, which have had a big impact. This closes the Fair part of the talk. So Fair showed that giving workers and organizers access to data can help them collect evidence that informs policy. But evidence doesn't stop being useful once policy is passed. In fact, once workers have access to tools like this, they often find new uses for data-driven evidence. So that brings me to the next project, which is Fair Share. And so here the question is slightly different. So instead of asking how evidence can support new policy, I ask what happens after policy creates new rights. In this case, workers needed evidence to access those rights, especially around deactivation appeals. So the next part looks at how data transparency can help workers turn legal protections into something that they can actually use. So the deactivations that workers are subjected to are a result of passenger and vehicle safety or arbitrary AI and algorithmic decisions about background checks and account verification. So in Washington state, after recent state regulation, which establishes a process to dispute wrongful deactivations, it was found that 80% of the cases were reactivated. And again, this is not surprising because Uber says that they continuously monitor the platform as they should, but signals are flagged using behavioral anomaly detection models, which are inherently stochastic. Deactivations are a widespread concern. We've seen hundreds of posts on Reddit of deactivation notices here across Uber and Lyft. Washington House Bill 2076 was passed in 2022 to make things better for workers. This began in Seattle and expanded to the entire Washington state. So it establishes a deactivation appeals process, representation rights from a worker organization, due process, just cause protection, and recover unpaid compensation. And this is where our contribution lies for this work. One of the provisions of Washington's House Bill 2076 is a means for reactivated drivers to recover unpaid compensation based on average per day during 12 weeks prior to deactivation. But the platform actually doesn't disclose this data, and the law doesn't require them to disclose this. And so there's no easy way for the driver representative to estimate this. And that's where we decided to step in to assist using our Fair data. Here's a brief overview of our methods. So first, we did formative interviews to understand the problem that organizers faced. Then we developed the tool, we deployed it, and finally evaluated how well it works for the organizers. During our formative interviews, we found that union representatives would capture screenshots from their driver profile and transfer it to Microsoft Excel manually. And sometimes they cannot access any data because the driver actually can't log into their accounts. And all of this was very time consuming and caused a lot of errors. So to mitigate this, we expanded Fair to include a way to estimate the unpaid compensation and generate arbitration-ready reports. So drivers would sign up using Fair. After the data syncs, drivers would have access to a dashboard to generate arbitration-ready reports with estimated unpaid compensation. And this workflow is what we call Fair Share. We then deployed this and observed it for 3 months. We had 143 account signups. To evaluate the tool, my collaborator Samantha and I traveled to Seattle, We found that the report generation time reduced to minutes, also reduced manual errors, but as with any new technology, it created new tensions, like tensions around consent, need for capacity, and aligning incentives for tool adoption. So just because there was a tool, organizers were not going to immediately adopt it widespread. Here's a view of the dashboard and the generated report for a driver. On the left part of the image, you can see what the organizers would see, the number of drivers who have signed up, a list of names, email addresses, whether the data is synced. And on the right side, there's a preview of what the report would look like. And this is something that the legal team of the driver representative organization would use in arbitration and if it goes to trial. Okay, so here's a picture from our field visit from March 2025. This was the Drivers Union office in Seattle. All right, so all of these efforts were part of the Workers' Algorithm Observatory, or the WOW for short, and we began in 2023. So the WOW is co-directed by Dana Kalachi, who should be on the call, and Andres, where we build tools with organizers around the US to crowdsource detailed data about rideshare and delivery work. Great. Okay, so to close, I want to summarize the dissertation in 4 points. The first, I've shown how we can study AI's labor impacts from the ground up by starting with how workers experience, interpret, and make sense of these systems in their daily work. Workers are best positioned to understand their own working conditions. Second, I've shown that independent evidence of those impacts can be useful for policy. It can make opaque systems more visible, make harms more concrete, and support organizing, legislation, and appeals. Third, researchers can play an important role here by building systems, conducting studies, and creating methods that help workers and their representatives act on what they already know. And so ultimately, I think that the future of work should not be determined only by AI systems or platform decisions. It should be shaped through worker-centered evidence, legal protections, and policy mechanisms that give workers agency over technological change. Okay, so with that, I want to spend a few minutes on acknowledgements. None of this would have been possible without the many people that I want to acknowledge here. So I'll get to that now. So first, I want to thank my advisor, Andreas. Andres has been much more than an advisor to me. He's been a mentor, a friend, and a model for the kind of researcher and the person I hope to become. There's so many memories, but 2, I think, which really stood out. I remember when I just joined Andres's group and I was applying for the doctoral consortium at CHI, and I needed a reference letter, and I realized that just the night before. And I just joined the group and I was thinking, oh, if I ask Andres, maybe he'll think I'm not organized, I do everything in the last minute. But I told Andres the night before and it was due and he did submit it. And so that was really, really nice of him to do that. Another memory which also stood out, and several of these, so I was going to give a job talk for my dream faculty job at the University of Washington. And Andres listened to my practice talk so many times, even the night before at like 8 p.m., just before I left for Seattle. So he always had my back. And I think this opinion is shared by many. So in 2023, some of our students wrote letters to nominate Andres for the Graduate Student Mentoring Award. So I was helping organize and coordinate some of the letters, and this is an annual award that Princeton gives. It's one per division, so you compete with everyone else in like engineering here. And I was looking back at the letters that I had access to, and I'm a student of HCI, and so as typical HCI researcher, I have some quotes here to read out. So here are some quotes. So Andres's mentorship extends beyond academic and professional growth. He's our friend. Those who know Andres will agree he has an amazing ring of positive energy. He will do everything he can to help you. And he was always available to meet and provided actionable feedback. So this is the quote which I think best summarizes all of our opinions. So he's a role model whose influence has been pivotal in my development as a researcher and an individual. So thank you, Andres. had a very good tradition. Arvind has also recently won the award, and I hope that trend continues for the many, many years to come. And like Andres said, I'm very proud to be his first PhD student. Next, I'm very deeply grateful to my committee, Solon, Arvind, Peter, and Manuel. Solon really helped me sharpen the framing of my thesis, my dissertation, think carefully about my research and career paths, and he was so generous with his time. Arvind constantly pushed me to be more ambitious and to see the broader impact of my work, often before I did. And Peter gave me generous feedback, advice on my job search, helped me think about the larger stakes of this research. And Manuel taught me a great deal about computational social science methods, has been a wonderful intellectual and community presence at CITP. I think I'll forever remember all of these interactions. It's been one of the greatest privilege and honor, I think, of my PhD to have been a part of and worked with the WOW. I'm especially grateful to Dana, Samantha, Andrew, Caroline, and Andres. So Dana has been a great collaborator. Many of you know Dana. She was a postdoc here. She helped me frame my work and my talks. I learned so much from her about giving talks. We were introduced when she was a postdoc here at CITP. It's been so nice seeing her become faculty and grow her own lab. Samantha has been my closest thinking partner throughout the PhD. So much of this work was shaped through our many conversations, even though we may disagree on so many things. I've learned so much from her and will really miss working together. I was just looking back while writing the acknowledgement section of my thesis last month, which I think is the part which is most read in computer science dissertations. But I was doing some back of the envelope calculations and I see that we exchanged more than 10,000 Slack DMs over the years. And this is just DMs, right? So not on shared channels. So Andrew taught me how to be a better engineer. He was so patient with all of my many questions. And Caroline helped make the WOW into the thoughtful and well-run collaboration that it has now become. I'm also grateful to the Princeton HCI group and all members of the CITP community. These were the two intellectual homes on campus that shaped this dissertation. As I mentioned a few days ago at the year-end CITP luncheon, I think they supported a very unique PhD, where we never actually began a new major project by asking, what's the next paper that we actually want to write? It was more guided by the societal impact that we wanted to have on the communities that we care about and what role computer scientists might play in that. I also want to thank several Princeton mentors and support systems that have helped me find my footing here. Noah, which was again a CITP alum and who many of you might know, so through the Grad Futures mentorship program, he was a very important guide to me during my first year here at Princeton. Mona Wang, again a CITP alum, through this CS department's mentorship program, helped me navigate my early years here as well. Dean Seneris, who's here in the room, was so encouraging and helpful during the tougher initial years of my PhD. To all the grad students in the room, please leverage the amazing resource that you have in the graduate school. The staff are always ready to help you in whatever way possible. Lisa, who's also here, and her family, through our community, Princeton Community Connect, welcomed me with extraordinary kindness and made Princeton feel more like home. And I'm also grateful to the winter session team that I was lucky to be a part of. Judy Jarvis here and many others. They made one of the darkest times of the year filled with joy, and it's one of my happiest Princeton traditions, and I'm really glad I was able to be a part of it. I'm also very grateful to the teaching faculty in Princeton CS, so Ruth, Victoria, Mariam, and Vikram. They were so generous with their time. Some of them are also managing parental leave, but they gave me so thoughtful feedback on my teaching and job materials. They showed me how meaningful and joyful teaching can be. And I really learned a great deal from them, and I hope to carry that forward in my own career. So apart from my doctoral research, I also spent a lot of time doing CS education research to help me become a better teacher. So I want to thank the CS education crew here, Michael Schindler, Seth Paulson, Matt, Arushi, Michael Liu, and Randy. So they introduced me to CS education research. I'm especially grateful to the faculty here, Michael for his help during my faculty search, and to Seth for his generosity during 6C. He allowed me to share his hotel room when I didn't have funding to attend. I was also fortunate to spend a lot of time in wonderful research communities outside Princeton. I'm very grateful for my time at AWS AI Labs. At Microsoft Research, I'm very grateful to Solon and the broader FATE community for hosting me. That internship had long been a personal ambition of mine for when I began my PhD, and it gave me a chance to work with a community whose research I had long admired and also cited for many, many years. So this picture in the middle that you can see here is actually really interesting. It was from my time at FAT last year during the Microsoft internship, where it had 5 generations of Solon's interns, and I was the only current intern at that point. So that's Solon, Wesley, Emily, myself, and Angelina. I also spent a semester at the Center for Democracy and Technology through the Google Policy Fellowship. So thank you to CDT and the research team for hosting me and introduced me to the world of civil society research. Finally, I want to thank the mentors who helped me get here in the first place. So from Presit, my undergrad institution, I'm grateful to Gauri ma'am, Virat sir, Kavi sir, and NSK sir for encouraging me to pursue an academic path. Many of them did their PhDs in the US in top schools, but they chose to return almost immediately to India to teach at Presit, which isn't one of the most highly ranked institutes, or not yet, I think we're getting there, but I'm so grateful that they did and inspired students like me. From my old lab at CMU that I had the privilege of being hosted for a summer, especially grateful to Semeng. We had so many candid conversations about PhD that summer. That also led me to return to CMU for my master's. And so I'm very grateful to Julia and Luyo, who I came to know very well during my master's, taking courses with, and also did research. I think I'm only here because these mentors believed in me very early. So this slide is not really about research, but it captures so much of what the PhD meant to me. It was not just papers and deadlines. It was also group lunches, rowing, laser tag, runs around campus, friends visiting, and many moments of joy that made this place feel like home for me. And I think these communities carried me through the hard parts of grad school and made the good parts much more memorable. I want to end by putting as many names as I could on one slide, because this dissertation was shaped by so many people, far more than I can thank in a few minutes, but each person on this slide supported me in some way. And so finally, I want to recognize and thank my parents who also traveled all the way just for this defense. My next position, I'll be joining Apple. I'll be part of Jeff Bigham's responsible AI team based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If anyone's visiting Boston, don't be a stranger. Okay, with that, thank you all for being here.
We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. And then, yeah, maybe raise your hand if you have a question.
And I guess on Zoom, if someone has questions, they can unmute and ask.
Same, and then.
I wanted to go back to one of the, well, first, congratulations, and this is amazing work. So thank you for sharing everything. I wanted to go back to like something earlier in your slides around the Fair project, where you were talking about drivers' estimates of what the take rate was, and they thought it was 50%, and they thought what was fair is like 20 to 25, and then it turns out the actual rate is much closer to what they thought was fair. Could you talk a little bit about like how they responded to the actual take rate and what their feelings were about, like
Yeah.
what has to change?
Yeah, I think they were surprised for sure, and so I think that also influenced the type of like how they actually use the data. So initially, I think they wanted aggregates to impact the work that they do, but ultimately they decided to use examples of very high take rates to actually impact their work. So that was one way that they responded. The second was also a difference in the way we calculate take rate versus the way that the drivers and other organizers think that take rate should be calculated. And so we did not actually account for insurance and other things separately. And so that resulted in a big difference. And so our take rate was actually much lower, which was just the platform fees and did not include like the tips, and it didn't include insurance, government taxes, and other fees. It was only the platform fee. So that was like a difference in the way we calculated take rate.
Yeah, this was incredible, and you just explained everything so clearly. One question I have is, you mentioned that platforms increase their take rate during surge prices. That seems like it goes against the whole point of surge pricing. Do you have any idea why they do that?
We don't have any concrete understanding of why that happens, but it's just that the entire benefit of those increased customer prices are not passed down to the workers.
It's like a false flag almost.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, maybe we can move on to committee questions. And any of the committee, maybe we can start with Solon. So you got on the screen now, and then we can move to the committee members here in the room. Solon, can you hear us?
Yep, I can. Can you hear me too?
Yes, let me show you here. There you go.
Great. Well, thank you, Varun. No matter how many times I read or hear about your work, it's always such a pleasure to see it all come together. And it was really a lovely talk. I actually had a different question as the first question. I'm sorry I didn't catch the person's name who asked the question, but I know in the dissertation itself, you kind of mention how like various partners that you worked with who were confronted by like somewhat unexpected findings responded to those things. And I want to kind of push you to maybe just talk a little bit more about that, right? So like in the assessment of like the Facebook ad delivery, some of the findings were maybe counter to expectations, or certainly like the intentions a lot of people have in the broader academic community. As we just heard, right, like the take rate was perhaps actually lower than what people expected. I'm kind of curious, like what you as a researcher think you're supposed to do in those situations, right? Like, do you feel like you have like a normative position that might not necessarily align necessarily with your partners, or do you feel like you're always kind of just working in the service of whatever strategy your partners might have in mind?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Solon. That's a really interesting question. And this is something that we wrestle with throughout, I think. And there's potentially different opinions, like even within the group. I think the way I look at this is the role of a researcher is to produce independent evidence, and it's left to like the partners to decide how actually they want to use it. And so even though like the take rate ended up being much lower than what they expected, like we still did produce reports which had these average statistics. It wasn't something that we actually excluded, but ultimately like it was left to the organizers to decide what form of that data they would actually want to use. If they did want it, we did include some of those statistics as well. We did help them with creation of some of these visuals related to those egregiously high take rates, but any report or any academic paper that we had, it painted like the complete picture that we had. It wasn't just these narratives that the workers actually wanted to align with.
Okay, ask a quick follow-up question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this may be a funny question for me to ask, given that I work at Microsoft, but I'm curious, like, it seems to me that like part of the value of the work that you're able to do is like the perceived independence of academic researchers. And so presumably for certain policy stakeholders or policy audiences, the fact that some of this information is being generated in an academic setting gives it like a degree of credibility that it might not have if it were being done by the company itself or by like, someone who had a more obvious financial interest. And so again, I'm curious here, like what the long-term strategy is, right? Like, do you adopt a position that like, no matter what the particular strategy of the partners you might be working with, you're sort of willing to allow them to use the evidence as they please? Or do you feel like you need to actually maintain some degree of independence that preserves the value that you offer as this kind of independent academic?
Yeah, I think that's also a really interesting question. I think we are ultimately like academics here, and I think our role here is to produce that independent evidence. And I think there's different like theories of change that you can have, right? And I think again, this is where I think we differed even within the group, like across Dana, Samantha, and I. And I think we may have different theories of change. I think for me, like the theory of change is kind of to be an independent academic researcher and also potentially collaborate or work with platforms, because ultimately that is who we want to influence and kind of impact change there. And so that's the type of change that I would hope to bring. But I think there's different people who have different opinions. Another theory of change could be more adversarial, where you only work with the partners and align with their incentives and kind of help build like resistance from the worker communities. But I think ultimately we do need change from all directions. And I think whether you're within the company, outside the company, I think we all still align on the broader purpose of the type of impact that we want to have.
Thanks so much, Varun. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Manu?
Thanks so much for the presentation, Varun. I have a couple of questions around the first study on the Facebook audit. I mean, one question that I would have, and I understand here that there's a question around the legality of job ads in the US that has been set historically, and like that's not a question about whether this would be allowable under such a law or not, but there seems to be this fundamental conflict here around user preferences as expressed through something like click-through rate on these ads and the delivery of ads, right? So basically, right, like there's a sense in which if you change the gender of the person being in the ad, people would identify more with the ad and would click through more with that. So like I'm wondering kind of like, and in the end of your like of the presenting this paper, you mentioned that like like this may decrease the utility of the ad because less people will engage with this, and I wanted to push back on that point, right? In the sense of like kind of how should like user preferences be added to the equation here, or shouldn't they be added at all, right? Like, do you still feel that there is no value in adding these user preferences? Like one way to see this as a broader thing is that it's actually a very hard thing to do an experiment on, because this is a market where a bunch of ads are competing for users' attentions, right? And your manipulation is a single ad within this broader market. You're not manipulating the whole market in itself. So I'm questioning like should it, like, to which extent, like what kind of utility would need to be delivered through this click-through rate to overcome the problems with like potential discrimination? Or do you think this would always not be the case, right? Like, is there any utilitarian argument for that would make you change this recommendation or not?
Yeah, I think the view that I still like adhere to here in this work is for job ads or housing ads, I don't think that there should be any optimization, irrespective of like user preferences on Facebook, because ads are something which just ultimately like users just get shown. It's not something that they can actually like exercise a lot of agency over. But over other ad categories, right, like products and other things, I think there is like a lot of value in having these kind of user preferences, giving users control over whether they actually want to see it. But I think for jobs, I don't think that the platform should have such a big impact on deciding who gets to see it, just because it's like a really it's a impactful like decision on a person's life.
But would something around the outcomes change your mind? Like, is like if you have different configurations of like this world with algorithmic ad delivery for jobs has better matching of jobs and people versus this world without, would that be something that would mediate whether this is allowable or not?
I think it's tricky, right? Because like the utilitarian argument here is always going to not satisfy someone, and customizing it completely through like a deontological like reasoning method is also like really tricky, where everyone needs to have their own like preferences. So yeah, I think it is really hard. I mean, it's an open question, I think, especially in such a domain to explore this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure, maybe one quick question. Wonderful talk. I've seen a few versions of this. It's gotten better each time, and the research itself is really awesome. On some of the problematic user interface aspects, like surge pricing, the boundaries not being clear that you showed, I was wondering if any of that crosses the line into dark patterns and perhaps becomes legally actionable that way.
Yeah, that's a good question. We are actually interested, I know Samantha isn't here, but that was something that we wanted to look into in the future. We have been working with NELP, the National Employment Law Project, where they had drafts of bills, and they had included a provision in NELP to actually ban dark patterns on platforms like this. And so, but then we were actually explaining to them what exactly dark patterns are. Can this be construed as a dark pattern? So there is attempts at both the federal and the state level to prohibit or think about these as dark patterns and take action against them, but it's easier said than done, right?
Peter.
Yeah, I mean, same as Arvind said, I think we've seen many iterations, and it keeps getting better and better. More interesting research keeps getting added to the talk, and wonderful to see all the impact that you've had. I'm kind of curious how you think about regulations like Colorado's. One of the slides that you had in the actual reporting that Uber does or Lyft does is that they show sort of negative take rates, and then they're kind of showing how much money they're losing by paying out workers so much. To what extent do you think that the transparency requirements can be by platforms themselves can be leveraged to show kind of numbers that are favorable to the companies themselves? It seems like there's a lot of these kind of fees and taxes and like accounting mechanisms that could potentially be used to adjust the numbers in different ways, and I'm kind of curious to what extent you have seen or looked at data, or if anybody has identified like potential mismatches between what you've seen with Fair and the other projects versus what is being reported by the platforms for the area, or is it so aggregated that you can't really have that comparison?
Yeah, we actually haven't done that specific comparison. I think when we were building Fair, Samantha and a few others, I think, verified manually. Like they actually took an Uber ride and then had the driver like sign up to that. Then we synced the data and saw like the data that we get, whether it's the same as what's on the app. But we haven't done that at scale. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if anyone has done that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess I'm also wondering more normatively how you think about the actionability of the transparency that is provided, and whether you think that gives the workers more actionable mechanisms, or do you think more is needed after that transparency requirement? Is there more needed to provide more actionability to workers?
Yeah, I think transparency, the way I view it, is just the first step, right? I think it's just the first step towards understanding like what the problem is, and there's a bunch of different things that can be done to make things more actionable post that transparency has been achieved. So one example that we can think of is like what is the impact of this transparency on tipping behavior, right? So there is an argument that is made that tipping could increase, tipping could also decrease, right? So the argument for tipping to increase is that customers now see how little drivers actually make, and so are incentivized to tip more. But the other argument is you typically tip on the service that you receive, and so if you paid $100 for the ride and the platform only like the platform kept $30 and the driver made 70, you would want to maybe pay 15% of 70 and not 15% of 100, and so the overall tipping could decrease. And so that's like one example of what transparency, like follow up from this transparency could help us understand. Yeah, I think I view transparency as just like the first step towards something broader.
Well, one last question, more meta about the kind of research that you've been doing. As you highlighted here, like it's a lot of impact directly into communities and very collaborative with people within Princeton, outside Princeton. But I'm curious if you could reflect on the challenges of doing that kind of research and what sort of recommendations or tips you may have for future grad students who want to engage in this kind of research, things to avoid, things to double down on from your experience.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Andres. Yeah, so I think I have given this some thought. I think obviously the positives of this work are that it can be very impactful, right? Like it really impacts people's lives. It can change, it can result in potential legislation to pass. But it does come with challenges in that like we are still like an academic center and we are PhD students within the computer science department, and there is always this tension, I think, at least for me, between academic impact and societal impact. This kind of research takes a lot of time. Like you have to establish these relationships with partner organizations. Policy timelines don't always align with grad student timelines and conference deadlines. Your partner's timelines may be very different from like your own timelines. Like you might have a deadline to make this paper, but then maybe your partner isn't like responsive, right? Like what do? You don't make that deadline. And so the potential cost of that will be maybe at the end of your PhD, you might have lesser number of papers compared to someone who didn't kind of do this kind of more impact focused work. But that's a trade-off that I think you need to kind of make for yourself as a grad student about like what you want to value. It's not that we didn't have any academic impact. Like all the work that we did publish was published at top tier venues. We did like go through the peer review process, but it takes time and it takes effort. You will be sometimes frustrated that there's no response from partners. I remember Manuel and Andres and I were trying to work with the work with a partner in Brazil, and it has been very challenging. We were very excited about the project, but and we did win a grant. It's been really challenging, actually, kind of building that relationship with the partner. The partner has different priorities. Like, how do you, as an academic, like try to align with the priorities that the platform has, so that you can like leverage and like build off of what they're doing, while still getting like the academic impact that you want to have. So it's tricky. I would think maybe like in the initial years of your PhD, if you kind of are able to like have a couple of papers and get that out of the way, then I think maybe you will get some time to like free up, and then you can like pursue some of these more ambitious projects, which are inherently risky, right? But can be more impactful. But maybe like having those initial papers in your PhD can give you that space to explore. But yeah, ultimately I think it's a decision that you need to make for yourself, and like what you value post PhD and type of path that you want to pursue.
All right, with that, we are going to ask the audience to please leave, and before we leave, please thank Varun.